For all of those you who have just joined, please make sure you open up the chat box and go ahead and introduce yourself with your name and where you're calling in from in the traditional territory that you're living on. And just a couple of housekeeping items. We are going to be recording this webinar and it will be available. We're going to dig into some of the questions that were asked at last week's webinar that we didn't have time to get to. And so Mark and Jens will be doing the majority of the talking today, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end in case there's any additional follow-up questions. But really quickly, I will introduce everyone again. So we have Jens Wieting, our Senior Forest and Climate Campaigner. Jens has been with us for 13 years. Welcome, Jens.
Hello again.
Great. And then we also have Mark Worthing, who is currently called the Coastal Projects Lead, who's been working on climate, conservation, and forest issues with Sierra Club BC for how many years, Mark?
5, almost 6.
Great, well, thank you for joining us. And then we also have working in the background our communication specialist, Maya, who will help monitor the chat box and make sure that everything goes smoothly. Welcome, Maya. Okay, so let's just jump right in. Mark, do you want to kick us off going over some of the themes of the questions that we weren't able to get to last week?
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks, Jens. Nuko kia wala Gillies, nuko Mark. Again, calling in from unceded Coatsum territories here in the Cowichan Valley. And always sort of cognizant and mindful with the caliber and the type of work that we're doing with where we're doing it and how we're conducting our business. So Heiska to the Cowichan people, where I conduct myself currently, hoveled away here at home. I just got off a phone call with a reporter from Northern Vancouver Island who is very concerned that the forest sector was leaning pretty hard into this COVID moment with their logging on Northern Vancouver Island. And this reporter was pretty concerned that watchdog groups like ours weren't out there to check up on what forest companies and loggers are doing in the woods right now. And that's a concern that I share with her. So it's kind of part of the framing around what we're hoping for with just recovery stuff and shift to more sustainable economies through a stimulus package that the BC government and the federal government are putting in place. So that's where my head's at today. It's just worrying about the actual forest right now and that there's no one there to watchdog. Last week was a lot of fun. We had a myriad of questions, 40 or so questions that we've kind of bundled into themes a bit. Questions around tidal lands, Indigenous protected and conservation areas. We had questions about whether it's more important to do forest restoration as opposed to forest conservation, or a bit of both. Some basic questions about forest management, data, federal regulations like SEPA, the Canadian Environmental Protections Act, and some amendments there. So on and so forth, questions about biomass. And so we'll touch on those big themes and do our best to kind of go priority ranking down through where most of the themed questions were at, down into some of the more specific ones. And of course, a couple of the key big questions and big themes that came out were the sort of where's the BC government at in the progress of things, what's wrong with the BC government, why aren't they taking action, and how fundamentally do we influence the government? So those are sort of the big themes. Of course, a little bit around economics and, does it kill more jobs than it creates to end old growth logging, or what type of conservation economy should we be advocating for, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll just kind of, Jens is going to go into a little bit about where things are at with the BC government right now, and sort of that arc of advocacy and policy work. But just quickly, the $1 million question that we get day in and day out is how how do we end this insane old growth logging? You know, how do we protect ecosystems? It's crazy making to think about why we're still fighting this, you know, since the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, 2000s, 2020, right? There's these waves of forest defense work that happen. And we all have different paradigms and memories of how we've engaged in trying to protect the old, ancient, endangered rainforests that seemingly are always getting logged. There's this amnesia effect and shifting baselines that create a very confusing social dynamic and political dynamic around what's really happening in the woods. Have we logged it all already? Is there lots left, et cetera, et cetera? And a lot of the time this boils down to tactics. How do we do it? What do you want me to do at the end of this webinar when I walk out the door and I want to go and do something to try and protect the ancient endangered ecosystems that are threatened right now? What do I do? And this is a fabulous question. And I'll just touch on it briefly right now before we talk about the BC government, which is that, you know, to be honest, if we knew exactly what to do, we'd be doing it. And there are things that are effective tactics and strategies that we are doing, many of which you already know, many of which we'll go into a little more in this webinar. But I think one interesting thrust is that I'm a big believer that when we're talking about social movement dynamics, cultural change, political change, policy change, fundamentally trying to shift the way we've structured our societies, our economies, our cultures, our value systems, that the only way to meet that titanic struggle is with a titanic diversity of tactics. So we will always need to be doing economic analysis. We will always need to be doing government lobbying. We will always need to be working with diverse coalitions. We need biologists. We need musicians. We need bankers. Anybody that fundamentally wants to see system change working in the different niches that they tend to occupy based on their identity, their privileges, their capabilities, their skills. So when people ask us, what do we do? What's the thing to do? Come on, you don't need to just talk about how wonderful the forests are and how crazy it is they're getting logged. Let's roll our sleeves up and get down to some work. I would say, who are you? What is it that fundamentally are your gifts that you can bring to this? Are you a musician that can hold court to a big audience of people that are going to listen to your cello performance or whatever it is you might be performing? Take a moment to talk about it. You know, explain what it means to you as an artist to have access to forest spaces to play music in, as respite, as recreation, whatever it might be, or maybe it's just a value of yours. So if you're a cellist and you have an opportunity to use that platform to advocate for old growth forests, then do it. If you're an economist, maybe that's running a pension plan for the BC Teachers Federation, and you happen to notice that the BCTF pension plan is quite invested in mosaic forest products or Western forest products, and you know for a fact that they're logging old growth right now, maybe you might want to bring that up in the next meeting you have around how you'll make recommendations or advice in stabilizing that pension investment program. If you're a teenager and you're in school and you're really bored with your teacher's projects, maybe you want to think about doing a social studies project on what the dynamics were in the Clayoquot Sound protests in the 90s, what circumstances were at play there, what's different now, and do that work so that you can start to think about how contexts have changed and what tactics we can learn from the 90s and the early 2000s and transplant those into right now, right? Because there were a lot of lessons learned then. We wouldn't do things the same. And there's a lot of great wisdom then that we need to transplant and bring into now. So, of course, you know, phone your MLA, let them know that you're not happy with the way that cabinet is not doing anything yet on protecting old growth forests. You know, there's some basic kind of entry point stuff that we all need to be doing on a regular basis. I'm constantly on the phone with politicians or mid to low level bureaucracy folks in the regional district, et cetera, et cetera. We need to do all that work. And then also, I would just say, you know, think creatively. Don't even wait for us. Don't wait for us to tell you what to do. What inspires you? What makes you feel like, you know, I've had this idea. itching away at me for a long time, and I want to mobilize on that. You can ask for help, you ask for advice, we can point you in a good direction, or we can uplift you and sort of develop certain leadership skills that you want to develop. Phone us anytime, engage with any of our staff, of course, but also don't wait for us, right? Just start playing around. Do not wait for the perfect theory of change to do the imperfect thing that will ultimately be part of the whole spectrum of what creating a social movement to create social change requires. So just wanted to touch on that briefly. We can go into some more fun tactics and ideas and stuff later, or send me an email or call me if you want to explore some of that, but just wanted to touch base on that for a minute. Maybe I've rambled a bit here, so I can pass this over to Jens to talk directly about the BC government. I'll say, so some of the key questions, just to sort of bring us back to last week, you were asking, what's the latest with the BC government policy on old growth? What can change the game? There was questions around BC timber sales and years of granting cut blocks to huge multinationals. You had questions about, can we expect an old growth ban in the next decade? Which politician should I write first? What should I say in my letters to politicians? With regards to the BC government's response, especially around old growth, if it's not good enough, what can citizens do to up the ante? So yeah, I'll pass it over to Jens, just to give you a bit of a brief on where we're at with the BC government and why this 6 months starting right now are so critical.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm working from home today, as many other days, in East Vancouver, from the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and I'm looking forward to our time today because we have a little bit more time to go into some details. Last time felt a little bit rushed and really trying to cover lots of topics. Thanks to Mark for giving us some ideas, and I hope to give you a little bit more, a few more answers to some of the questions, and hopefully pointing out lots of resources that exist where you can find out more. And it's a pretty exciting time. It's also a very difficult time because of the pandemic, but it's definitely a time where we all see examples of governments actually taking action based on science, and we really want that, looking at the natural world and looking at climate, and things are shifting pretty dramatically. It's difficult to remain hopeful looking at the facts, but it's also pretty clear that with old growth and the natural world disappearing, that more and more people are getting concerned. And the question is, when will our governments act, and will they act in time? Can we collectively build the power in time before it's too late? And I'm confident that we will see the change, but we cannot be certain whether it's in time before it's too late. So I will use a few slides. There are many that we couldn't use last time, and there's more news every day. So quickly, give me 1 second here. So I hope that my slides are up now. Just have to start them full screen. Some of my thoughts that I just shared, you can also read up on in an article just published in the National Observer. Earth Day 50 is over. So how do we get to Earth Day 100? And one of the key thoughts I want to leave you with today is that all these examples of action in response to COVID-19, that's exactly what we need. And I think that one clear difference between COVID and the threat to the natural world is that the pandemic happened very quickly, and people get really upset when they see things moving so fast. And it's more challenging with the natural world and climate action, but clearly when a threat becomes too big to ignore, we can change course, we can build change. And that's just my key point here I want to start with. And we see this backed up now with a lot of evidence. So this is the Guardian yesterday pointing to a new study from Oxford, a lot of evidence from the economists that clearly show that if our governments change course and invest to repair the global economy and put the world on track to tackle climate breakdown at the same time, we can see lots of benefits in the short term and in the long term. And this is related to a question that came up, by the way, about the economic value of forests and the tension between the perceived economic benefit of ongoing logging and the economic value of standing forest. And one of the key points to make here is clearly short-term versus long-term. If we don't change course, we will lose the long-term benefits that we need for a healthy economy. There are no jobs on a dead planet. So today is a very important day in BC because we are expecting Premier Horgan to speak about reopening the economy. So this is the Globe and Mail yesterday. BC may shuffle political priorities as it begins to reopen economy. So we want to shuffle political priorities. Unfortunately, what the Globe reported is that there's a lot of talk, and we will know better later today, about shifting the priorities in a way that sounds like we might see less climate action instead of more climate action, less action towards protecting the natural world. So I hope that this is not the case, but the messages we have seen in the last few weeks, for example, the fact that the carbon tax is the increase of the carbon tax has been delayed is not a good signal. It's not okay to delay climate action in the midst of a climate crisis. So we really have to keep an eye on this. And if we don't hear the message that we need today, this is another reason for all of us to take more action in the coming days and weeks. This is particularly concerning because we also see more warnings about increasing fire risk. So this is also in the news this week, warnings that we will see increased risk of fire again this summer, and it's really not looking good in the western part of the province. And of course, that's another concern in the context of forests and logging, because we know that in many parts of the province, recently logged areas will see an even higher risk of more fire in the coming years. So this is a slide that I used in the last webinar, but I want to pick up here and talk a little bit more about the examples that we need to see in the economic recovery. So the BC government has to step up to the plate and support those First Nations that actually want to protect more of their land. We see a lot of examples of business as usual and the BC government supporting nations that are going along with the system. Lots of examples of cooperation when it comes to logging, revenue sharing in some cases, which is good, but it must be based on science. And we cannot support a course where the BC government is essentially promoting logging of the last endangered forests and not supporting those nations that want to protect more. And Clayoquot Sound is a dramatic example where some of the nations have developed their land use vision for several years now, and they're still waiting for the BC government to step up to the plate, partner with the federal government, bring matching funding to support these solutions. So the other one, very briefly again, eco-forestry practices, support companies that actually want to change and use different practices where logging is appropriate. Restore provincial government capacity. This government has lost thousands of jobs under the previous government that are badly needed to ensure that we have monitoring, enforcement, research happening across BC. This should be included in the economic recovery discussion. Support for value-added wood products, more jobs per cubic meter, and ecological restoration projects. So I want to use this quickly again. The time for change is here. We have the climate crisis. We have outdated land use plans. We have increasing risk for old growth ecosystems. And because of climate change, business as usual means even more damage in the 21st century compared to the 20th century when we think about all the climate impacts that are already underway, from droughts to flooding and so on. So our economy is in fact moving to a place where we are less dependent on resource extraction, and we are now more dependent on intact ecosystems to sustain quality jobs in economic sectors that actually have a future, in contrast to boom and bust resource extraction examples. So we have shifting legal landscape, and we have growing support for old growth protection. I will talk a little bit more of the polling results in a moment, because I think they're incredibly important for all your opportunities to approach MLAs, reporters, media, or others to help build support for old growth protection. So I also want to remind everyone about the promise from the last election to step up to the plate and take action for old growth using evidence, using science, like the ecosystem-based management approach in the Great Bear Rainforest. We must not forget about this promise which was made in 2017, leading to the election which the NDP won, because we are now approaching an election again, and we have not yet seen it. So we have the old growth panel. We know the report has been shared with the VC government in the last few days. We have the changes in the forestry laws coming, but we don't know what they will look like. And we are still waiting for an old growth strategy 3 years after this government got elected. So every time you have an opportunity to talk about this, remind people about this promise. This government has delivered some promises, often in the context of social and economic projects, but we have not seen it in the context of old growth, and we have to use this strategically. So a reminder about the science used in the Great Bear Rainforest. There are still problems in the Great Bear Rainforest, but the key ingredient is clear. We need to use science, and this means that you have to come up with percentages. The red line, when you are below a certain threshold for old growth, you have to protect it. Because so many of the remaining old growth ecosystems are below these dangerous thresholds, we need moratoria. We need real leadership, and all of this must be combined with support for First Nations governance and support for their economic vision. And this requires funding. In the case of the Great Bear Rainforest, $120 million for coast funds, and we can build on this project, on this example in the Great Bear, and deliver and support funding for First Nations and non-Indigenous communities across the province. So we need a solution that will essentially have two key components on the conservation side. Protecting the last remaining intact areas. We often refer to them as hotspots. These are a few on Vancouver Island, and we need moratoria before it's too late for them. And we need support for those hotspots and regions where First Nations are already leading the way. And we have to make sure that they can inspire others, that it must be easier, not harder, for them to implement their solutions. This is a photo from January 2017 in Tofino, when the Ahousaht First Nation shared their vision with the public. Again, the federal government has already stepped up to the plate with 1.3 billion for the whole country, and 175 million were committed to for specific projects across the country, but some of them in BC. And we have not seen similar funding for the BC part of Canada to support Clayoquot Sound and other nations with the same leadership. That's a huge missed opportunity. And lastly, in terms of what the solutions must look like, this is an example how we used these dangerous red lines, the risk thresholds for landscape units on Vancouver Island and the South Coast. And this is exactly what we need, either in BC's forestry laws or as standalone legislation, a law that is clear that if an old growth ecosystem falls below a certain threshold, like 30%, you cannot log it. So this will require transition in some places because we cannot shut it down overnight, but we can use, the BC government can use maps and data like this to develop a real strategy, a real plan. One of the questions we heard was, what can the end of old growth logging look like? Like, how quickly can we ban it? And it must be a path, it must be a strategy, it must be a plan that can bring others on board, both in terms of supporting their needs, supporting them during the transition, and making a convincing case that this is based on science, that this is based on the trajectory of species extinction that must be addressed. And when you are in this deep red, then you have the highest ecological level of risk, and that's the highest level of urgency to act immediately. And more on this can be found in a report that the Environmental Law Center wrote for us last year, and that was submitted just in time for the July 15 deadline, looking at input for the changes in forestry laws. So, and the key lesson again is look at the 30% number, which is a really important one, based on science, to end old growth logging immediately if you have less than 30% of a specific ecosystem. Straightforward, and could be a starting point for the BC government. I'm not. I don't want to use the slide in the little time we have left today, but I will share the slides afterwards. And this is a reminder of the key asks that many of you and we shared with the BC government in terms of our expectations, what must be included in a revised forestry law. And again, we have lots of resources if you want to use this again in meetings with MLAs or media. Similarly, I will include more details about what exactly people said when we asked last year about support for defending old growth. It's a very strong result, not only in terms of the 90%, but also because we have seen similar support across the province, Northern BC, Southern BC, Northern Island, Southern Island, and we have seen an amazing understanding of the values of old growth forest. So from the urgency to protect old growth in the context of climate change, the importance of for First Nations cultural values, the importance to save the web of life depending on old growth, salmon, and really a strong understanding among the majority of people that were asked, close to 1,000 people, that old growth forests are critical to protect us from climate impacts. So I think we are now seeing a similar understanding in the context of the pandemic. This is really becoming mainstream knowledge that if we want to reduce the risk of disease, we have to protect intact ecosystems. And all of this combined is really making a strong case for action that we have to consistently use in every way we can, similar like Mark described, make sure that we are taking advantage of every opportunity. So again, I will share this, and it's all on our website if you want to read about the details. And just before I pause, I also want to remind everyone about our December 2019 report, Clear Cut Carbon, which showed just how much is being logged across the province in 13 years, resulting in sequestration dead zones. So there's no time to go into this today. Maybe we will have another webinar soon where we focus exclusively on forest carbon and climate. But please use this report whenever you have an opportunity. There's a good summary in the report, and the media release itself is also a pretty good shorter overview of the findings. Maybe this is a good moment to pause, because I can tell that it's 12:30 now. I have more, and I know there are more questions, but I want to pause here.
I can jump in if you want, unless Maya or Elizabeth, you had a couple thoughts.
So why don't you go ahead, Mark?
Cool. Yeah, really great questions coming in here in the Q&A thread. So pop those in the question and answer section.
Jens, do you want to just stop sharing your screen?
Just real quick, if I could kind of pepper some quick thoughts on the question things. Megan, do eco-forestry practices create more long-term jobs than the current logging practices? Yes, 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 and yes. Although it's a longer arc of economics as opposed to the shorter time crunch of profit-driven demands of the global market. And there's a whole bundle of policies that the BC government has in place that asphyxiates sort of that longer term eco-forestry practices from being competitive in current day market conditions. So that's why it's so offset and makes it so hard for eco-forestry to get a good foothold to actually be competitive and start providing those jobs, is the policies that are in place are barriers to them succeeding. So they're doing everything right, but the BC government needs to kind of stop strangle holding that archaic policy regime that current forest practices are under. Jack, timber companies are still doing their unsustainable old growth logging, mainly on unceded Indigenous territories. They're required to consult with First Nations now that UNDRIP is in place. What about a joint court challenge by civil society and First Nations filing one together? Yeah, I mean, great idea. Of course, we wait for that invitation from a nation that might want to pursue that. We're definitely entertaining different types of legal action in that way. One of the disappointing aspects of BC government policy right now is how few government regulations have teeth. So when we want to go to court over something that's clearly a moral violation, there aren't very strong environmental laws in place for us to use to enforce. So for something like UNDRIP, or in the current BC government legislative regimes called DRIPA, the Declaration of Indigenous Rights Act, DRIPA, it's a hybridized version from the United Nations piece of the UNDRIP, Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and their right to, for example, free, prior, and informed consent with resource projects happening in their territories. And this is a constant struggle. This is the titanic struggle that's happening in BC all over the place, whether we're talking about Site C Dam, the Wet'suwet'en, Unistoten, Gidimt'en camps that are fighting frack gas pipelines of Coastal GasLink and LNG projects, whether we're talking about the Secwepemc and Secwepemc-Uluk defenders like the Tiny House Warriors over near Kamloops with the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Both of those cases, the EDC, the federal government export development corporation, is basically shoveling money at public funds are being shoveled at fracking and tar sands pipelines in violation of Indigenous rights and title in the middle of a climate crisis. It's crazy. With logging, it's not so different, except there's this added pressure in a lot of remote coastal communities where there aren't a lot of jobs out there. And forestry is some of the only revenue opportunities that remote coastal First Nations have. So A, they should have, you know, full access and rights to any revenue being garnered off of their territory. So that is great. Whether they agree or disagree with those practices, that's another question. And whether they're being consulted or not is another question. So they're kind of segmented out into different columns. And I would say in some cases, logging companies are actually doing a pretty good job with a lot of First Nations. In other examples, it's awful. In both of those examples, the BC government is usually the ones setting the tone and lowering the bottom of the bucket in terms of expectations of what good engagement between a licensee and a First Nations or a local non-Indigenous community or a recreation club or hunters or whoever the kind of group is that's being engaged. And so the BC government often are the culprits in terms of setting the tone and quality of how they're supposed to be engaging with communities and First Nations in their territories. But Jack, I like your idea. The closest thing to it that we're actively engaged in right now is supporting the Untitled Nations title case to get their land back of the northern section of Nootka Island and a couple inlets near there, where they're looking to protect some of the last remaining old growth forests in their salmon spawning streams there on Nootka Island. And I put a link in the chat bar to the Chuffed fundraising page. If you feel compelled to donate, please do. Otherwise, still go check out that Chuff page because there's great, videos and interviews where you can learn more about that nation's experience in trying to get sovereignty and more control over their resources back, which I will add benefits everyone. You know, it's not a take back from non-Indigenous communities. It's a rollover of an old school management regime and a rebirth of a new reconciliation-based approach to land management. You know, I trust the people that have stewarded those territories far before Canada was even a concept, more than I trust the way the BC government is currently managing forests. So I would really, really hope that they get more control over their forests there. Just to ground wire back to another one of the themes around that we were hearing from some of the questions last week, which was the how. We know the why, but the how. And I touched on a couple tactics. And again, $1 million question, or maybe I should say the million tree question, would be how. And a lot of the time, what we bump up against in actually getting really good policy reforms and politicians making better decisions than they currently are is power. It's power, visibility, and political affirmation. So we know why, we know what the right course of action is, but it's a puzzle, it's a Rubik's Cube that these politicians make a calculus out of. And they're like, okay, 4-year cycles, maybe 8-year cycles they're thinking on if they're kind of a long-term thinker, which is unfortunate for 500-year-old trees. But you know, while they may even know, bureaucrats, policy analysts, MLAs, they know a lot of the time what the best thing to do, but they're just as challenged as we might be sometimes in figuring out how to make a political solution. And so for us, a lot of the time, it's about power building, not necessarily just about naming the best policy reforms, but creating the social dynamics that actually make the politicians feel like they have permission politically to make those changes. So when we're out in the streets and we're doing rallies and we're doing public talks and we're traveling different communities and trying to make sure that chambers of commerce are making statements that they see more revenue in saving old growth than logging it, when we're working with universities to put on lectures with academics around increasing our knowledge of forest ecosystems, when we're working with First Nations around gaining better access to bark harvests for weaving and traditional practices, all of those things raise the tide of the power we have as a collective social movement. And when we're most visible in showing that type of power, politicians can acknowledge it and say, hey, I have a political imperative to respond, to do the right thing, which we already know, which is all these policy reforms. Jens has illuminated a number of them. And so that gives them the will, the political will to, for example, include increased financing for the conservation economy in a stimulus package right now in a COVID crisis. But if they're not hearing that and they're getting more little bugs in their ear from the Truck Loggers Association or logging contractors having rallies in the lawn of legislature saying we want to log more old growth, we have to do it, then they're just weighing those odds. So fundamentally it's a volume question and how we flex. And I think, luckily this movement is really inclusive to try and make sure that we're not just killing jobs. Like, none of us want to see the forest sector hurting at all. In fact, I'd like to actually see the forest sector continue in perpetuity forever. But on its current course, it will not do that. It has to change somehow, one way or another, whether you like it or not. The forest sector will need to be completely restructured. And so what we're saying is, well, let's be mindful of especially forestry dependent communities and try and make those economic shifts earlier than later, so we don't end up, hurting families that have mortgages and are trying to put their kids through college and so on and so forth in the meantime. So we're trying to uplift the power so that politicians can actually do the right thing. That's like some of the concept work around the how. I think maybe I can roll to a different theme that came up in some of the questions from last week. And I'll actually invite Maya and Elizabeth if you want. One of the interesting questions that came up that we spent a lot of time thinking about and exploring is what are the most compelling storytelling that makes the links between forests and health that you know of? And what opportunities do you see to link health and forests? Do you see political capital with this framework within the current provincial government? So I don't know, Maya or Elizabeth, do you want to chime in on that, or Jens if you want?
Do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Maya. I'm on the communications team here and my background is in visual storytelling. So I was super excited when I saw this question come up. It's a really good one. There's a lot of different links and threads that we can pull because there are a lot of connections between forest and health. And right now, I think a huge thing is just shining a light on that and helping people connect those dots. Because if this pandemic has shown us anything, it's that our health and the health of our ecosystems are so intricately connected that you can't really separate them. So there's a lot of storytelling around, for example, water quality and air quality that comes from protecting large, intact, old growth forests. And when you log those, the impacts on communities, as well as in terms of like natural disasters, our health is impacted when we log and increase the chance of flooding and wildfires. And that has a distinct impact on communities, especially in the context of the pandemic, because how can you socially distance while evacuating a town from a wildfire or flooding risk? So those are huge, huge impacts that do need a spotlight. But then there's also different aspects of health. So you have like your physical health and community health, but then there's also mental and spiritual health that is so intricately connected with the forest, where there's countless studies showing how taking walks outdoors and forest bathing has distinct connections with reducing anxiety and stress, which is also just completely revitalizing, especially in the pandemic when everyone is feeling particularly heavy. So it's a hard question because there's so many important and powerful stories out there that we'd love to hear more from everyone, because everyone's unique stories do deserve to have that spotlight and to be shared, and to have these community level stories being put out there, I think can really help forming that emotional and personal connection that these aren't just trees, but they do have an impact in our everyday lives is incredibly important. And we're super excited to keep picking apart some of these threads, and we're looking forward to kind of diving deeper into these stories from video work and infographics and illustrations, and kind of taking a multimedia approach to help connect these dots for people.
Yeah, and I also just want to chime in that one of the things Mark mentioned earlier was about building power. And that is one of the critical things that this movement is missing, essentially, that when we look at the dynamics of power and who is able to influence government, it is not the environmentalists. If Sierra Club speaks to the government, they pretty much know what we're going to say already. And so if we're able to make connections with stories that are outside of the typical sphere, if we're talking about health from a physician's perspective, as opposed to an environmental perspective, it brings the conversation into a different way of being heard by politicians and by communities. And there's, I think that there's a general sense that, people in British Columbia are somewhat green, but they may not actively identify as an environmentalist, and they may even regard that word as a negative. And so when we talk about health, the sort of like stigma that might exist in people's minds is not there. Health is completely unifying. All beings want to be healthy and well. And so that provides us with an opportunity of connecting with an audience beyond what we would typically be able to if we came with the kind of message that's resonating with this group that's on this webinar, for example.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And Maya. Yeah, the storytelling components are fascinating, especially when it comes to power building. I'm like shaky with anxiety right now because it's springtime. It's not quite fire season, but the winter rains and snowpack has let up. And so now is the time that a lot of logging takes place. And in the last few years, this would be when I'd be launching our field season, and we'd be going out into the woods, checking up on what logging happened the previous fall in certain watersheds and so on and so forth. And this year, one of the key things we were going to be looking at is the sheer volume of waste wood that exists, especially in the more expensive to access locations of logging. With a lot of the valley bottom already gone, companies are going up into the mid elevations where the remaining old growth is. Often it's not in the valley bottom, it's upslope or in tributaries or a little bit higher up. And up there, it costs more money to build a road. They have to put A-mix and dynamite and blast those roads and have bigger machinery. It's just all more expensive to actually gain access to the trees to get that wood back to market. And so what that means is if the costs are increased, then they're not probably going to bother bringing some of the lower valued wood. They're going to bring out their most expensive premium stuff, and then leave a lot more waste on the block. And this is true all over the coast, all over BC, really. So waste wood has been a big issue, and also just it's just sad to see, when we need to be doing more value-added product development. There's small companies, small mills, woodworkers, all sorts of people that are chomping at the bit to gain fiber, but they can't actually get it. Again, these are policy barriers set up by the BC government. But what it does is it raises the question around waste wood, biomass, biofuels, wood chips, wood pellets, all this stuff. And so I'll maybe toss it over to Jens here to talk a little bit about biomass, waste wood, and sort of where our thinking's at with that.
Thanks. I want to use this opportunity to answer one of the questions I saw in the chat box related to biofuels. So this one is from Michael about the CRD looking at using refined biosolids from the Heartland wastewater treatment plant, potentially to use it in the context of reforestation, maybe in a liquid fertilizer form. So this is a difficult question, but very high level, I would raise a flag around the use of fertilizer in the first place. So generally, we want to promote forestry in a way where no such thing like fertilizer is needed. So generally, forestry should work in a way where forests can stay healthy and not be left as degraded ecosystems after some form of logging happens. The fact that the BC government is in fact using fertilizer should be a flag, because it shows that it's not the form of sustainable forestry that we are hoping for. In this specific case, whether biosolids from a certain place may be used in some form as a fertilizer, you also would have to look at where it's coming from. There could be a problem with pollution. So if this is coming from the wastewater treatment plant, there could be a strong argument for using it in a very controlled environment, like the one you mentioned here, which is the cement plants. So really needs careful research before we could answer such a question. But a reminder about biomass in general, also because it has become such an important topic in the context of the Planet of the Humans movie, that again, Jim Poja's report about certain myths in the context of forest and carbon, which you can immediately find if you Google the words Jim Poja, Sierra Club BC, you will find the report. Mentions, goes into some level of detail in the context of biomass and why we are so concerned about it. And the key point, again, is that if we burn biomass today, we have emissions today, and the whole idea of describing it as carbon neutral is very problematic, because we know that forests and trees need decades to grow. And if we burn something today, it will not be carbon neutral in the short term, and short term is what really matters in the context of climate action. And a lot more critical observations and references can be found in Jim Poja's report.
Jens, do you want to, sorry, not to interrupt, but just as you're speaking, maybe quickly address the question around why it's more important to conserve forests now than it is to do replanting or restoration?
Yeah. So quick recap, and you will find again more on this in the clear-cut carbon report, but the key concern here is really that the most important message from the climate scientists is that we have about 10 years to achieve massive reductions. And it's very interesting if you read our clear-cut carbon report, that essentially a clear-cut means that you don't have any carbon sequestration for more than 10 years, because it's a complete disruption of the ecosystem. And there's a lot of excitement about planting trees, but even when you plant trees, they need more than 10 years before they even begin to absorb a similar amount of carbon, like the annual loss that is still happening after clear cutting. Essentially, a clear cut is a carbon bomb where you lose a lot of carbon in the first year, and you still lose more in the coming years from decomposing carbon, from decomposing soil, organic matter in the soils, and all the wood waste left behind. And of course, it's worse if you also have slash burning, which means that you lose even more in the short term. So what we really need is a comprehensive vision that keeps as much carbon as possible in the forests and trees that already exist, and allows more trees to continue to sequester carbon. If you don't want to use the tree, don't cut it down, because every tree that we can leave standing can right away continue to sequester more carbon. And this is both true for very old trees and for trees that are somewhere in the medium age, between 70 and 120 years. But we have very few examples where trees, second growth trees, are allowed to grow older than 60, 70, or 80 years. We need longer life for all trees, both the very old ones and the second growth trees. We are almost approaching 1 o'clock. There was a question about BC timber sales, and I want to highlight again that you can find a number of examples on our website highlighting really worst practices in terms of business as usual logging in highly endangered ecosystems. And this is shocking in a number of ways. One is that it's happening at all, and secondly, that this is happening under the guidance of BC government staff paid by taxpayers. We really need to see an attempt to create a new version of BC timber sales, where BC timber sales, maybe with a new name, can become an example of forestry that we want, forestry that we need, best practices, not worst practices, like we are seeing right now. So BC timber sales is really a test case where the BC government has 100% control to start doing the right thing. Even if it's difficult to do it everywhere, we have to see it with BCTS. So again, something you can use whenever you have opportunities. And also a reminder about the climate risk assessment. Last year, the BC government shared a climate risk assessment. It shows 15 examples of potentially very dangerous climate impacts. Some of them are already underway, more are coming, and about 8 or 9 of these are directly related to forestry practices. And we really need the changes in terms of protecting more forest and changing practices to make sure that fewer people are at risk of losing their lives as a result of flooding and droughts and fire, which will only become worse. So again, this is all difficult, a difficult reality that we are living in, but I'm convinced that we will see change for the better. We cannot be certain whether we can pull this off in time, but there's overwhelming evidence. We see shifts in our economy, we see shifts in our society, and we see shifts on the entire planet. So the idea that things will always be the same is not realistic. We will either win this fight or we will lose it, but we have to stand up to win it. And I have some hope that there are people in this government who care about people. We have seen examples of this with COVID. And I want to work harder and not give up to make sure that they make the connections and understand that this is about our lives.
So 4 things. Oh, sorry.
I'm done. Thanks.
Things or 4 thoughts that I'll leave you with. In terms of actionable items that you could pursue. 1 is to donate to us. We continue to build a team of people that can do the policy work, the government relations and lobbying and advocacy work, the mobilization work, supporting local leaders, and doing field work out in the forest to watchdog what these companies are doing. So we're always looking to build our capacity and be able to deliver better work as a team here at Sierra Club. You can donate to different First Nations initiatives like the new Chuff page that I put a link in there. But if you're looking to do something with your own time right now, you can phone, because of COVID, maybe don't go to the office, but you can phone the local licensee, local logging company that has tenure in your area. So maybe it's Western Forest Products or BC Timber Sales or Interfor. If it's on Crown land, you have a right to see the site plans for how they plan to log and manage a certain valley. So just try that. Just, be polite and engaging. There's good people that work in forestry. So be polite and engaging and just assert your right to have access to site plans, which is how they design the roads, how they manage for old growth or marbled murrelet habitat or fish. They have a plan and a document there. It's called a site plan. And you should be able to see it. So just start there. Phone your local logging company that has tenure in your area, called a licensee, and ask for their site plans. Or right now and in the next 5 to 6 months, it's really critical that you advocate to your local MLA, regional district office, about the old growth panel report that the Minister Doug Donaldson is reviewing right now and trying to decide how seriously to take it. So he needs to hear from everybody that they need to do everything they can in their power to protect old growth forests and listen to the recommendations of that old growth review report. Gaila Kesla.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Jens and Maya, and everybody for joining us today. I also invite you to join us for our climate justice webinar next week, which I think will be really informative for a lot of you that have been wanting to understand the deeper reasons between why Sierra Club continues to focus on climate justice. You know, for a very long time, we've been talking specifically about saving the environment. And so in contemporary legal and social issues, these two things are really interconnected. And so I really invite you to come learn more about building power and the connections between climate justice and better environmental outcomes. And that'll be next Wednesday, same time at noon. And we will send up a follow-up email with some of the links that we provided in the chat box today. And thank you everybody for joining us today. Have a great one.